Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily. Today is Friday, April 26th, 2024. On today's episode of the show, we're going to be talking about Luca Guadagnino's new film, Challengers, and we're also going to present an interview with the movie's writer, Justin Kuritzkes. My name is Ben Pearson. I'm an editor at slashfilm.com, and I'm joined on today's episode by Slash Film editor, BJ Colangelo.
Hi.
BJ, what did you think about Challengers? Let's just get right into it. General thoughts. We'll save some spoilery stuff for a little bit later on, but broadly speaking, what do you think about this movie?
I love sexual tension, and this movie is dripping with it. That is my feelings.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite movies of the year so far. It is incredibly, seductive and full of tension, and you could slice the tension, with a knife in this movie. There's so much there's so much that's said in this film without actually saying things. There are so many looks between characters that are just loaded with meaning, and the churro scene. I mean, we'll get to it, but there are so many things in this film that are just very much right up my alley, and also very unlike typical mainstream American movies. You don't really see films that deal with this subject matter in this way coming out of America very often. And I know Luca Guadagnino is not an American director, but this is I think it's Amazon MGM Studios production kind of thing. So it's just an incredible achievement of filmmaking. It's so energetic. The pacing was awesome. It's we're bouncing back and forth in time. We're a tennis ball being hit back and forth over the net by these people. What were some things that stood out to you that you really loved about it?
So yeah, the pacing is definitely just so electrifying. I'm somebody who for a very long time did not understand tennis. There's no real cheering. It's very quiet. It feels very for me, tennis falls under the same umbrella of other wealthy exclusionary sports like skiing and lacrosse. And then I watched a tennis match and I was just riveted the entire time because you can feel the energy of a tennis match. And I feel like this movie does such a great job of capturing what that sensation is like and making you feel it through a film, because you feel like you're being volleyed. So when you were you feels like that we're a tennis ball being thrown between these characters, that is such an accurate way to describe it. And it also has such an undeniably sexy score. Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross are on another level with this score.
The score is unbelievable. It made me feel like I could lift a school bus and hurl it into the sun. It was just it's so pulse pounding and intense, and it really just adds this this kind of hypnotic quality to the movie that kind of heightens the intensity of everything that's going on. There are scenes where the score is playing over lines of dialogue, and I'm paying as much attention to the score as I am the lines of dialogue, which is typically not how these movies are sort of formulated. Typically music is under the dialogue, and at certain moments it feels like the two of them are sort of given equal importance by the filmmakers, which is just an interesting choice. And then I guess separate from that, the music itself is just killer. So
it's so good. I was telling a friend who saw it, this score is making sure that all of us remember that half of this songwriting duo wrote the song Closer by 9 Inch Nails, which is probably on more sex playlists than any song in history. Maybe Let's Get It On. If it's not that, it's Closer.
Yeah. The one thing that I mentioned about the feeling like we're a tennis ball, there's a moment where that is literalized, and that's my one thing that I didn't really care for in this movie. You talk about how it's sort of dripping with tension and style and all this, and I love the style of this movie for the most part, but there is one little section where it goes into some POV stuff, and there's a POV of the tennis players, and then I think there's a POV of the tennis racket, and then at one point there's even a POV of the tennis ball that is bouncing around between, in the middle of a match, and the camera is just spinning all over the place, and it's inventive. I haven't really seen anything like that before, but I kind of feel like that's for a reason, because I hated the way that looked and made me feel. It was just so, I understand, the sort of thematic significance of trying to put us in that position. and like make us feel that way as an audience, but like I just didn't care for it. So I don't know. Did you react strongly to the POV stuff? Thankfully, there's not really that much of it in the movie.
Yeah,
But
it's really jarring. I get a little seasicky with these sorts of things. But I thought that it was a really, like you said, it's a really inventive choice. It really does let people, I think, fully understand like how intense tennis can be,
mhm.
because from a distance, it doesn't look nearly as exhausting or as powerful, I think, than it is. It's like watching somebody hit a golf ball and it's like, wow, they did a great job, but you don't understand like what goes into being able to do that because they make it look so effortless.
Yep, yep.
And so honestly, what this reminded me a lot of is there's a show on Stars that I love called P Valley that's about like exotic dancers, and they do these like POV shots of the women on poles, and like they take the music out so that you can hear what it sounds like for them and like how intense it is and how it like exhausts their body.
Yeah,
And
like the skin gripping the poles and stuff like that. Is that what you mean?
like the trying to like get your body weight up the pole kind of thing, and it's like it's so incredible to watch. And I feel like, I can't guarantee it, but I feel like someone in the challengers camp was like, what if we did that but tennis? I don't know if it works as well because it is so fast that it's a bit disorienting, but I feel like that was the point, and like, mission accomplished. You did it.
So let's talk a little bit about the trio of actors here. We've got Josh O'Connell. This has been from the future. I just wanted to jump in here and say that for some reason I refer to him as Josh O'Connell. His actual name is Josh O'Connor. So sorry about that. I do that a couple times throughout this episode. Apologies to Mr. O'Connor. Here we go. Mike Feist and Zendaya, of course. I was not really familiar with Josh O'Connell very much. I'm trying to think if I've seen him
Was
in
in The
anything.
Crown.
Yeah, I haven't caught up with The Crown. So like, and I feel like he was in a couple other sort of like more like smaller indie kind of movies in the past few years.
La Chimera from last year that I think is having like another run this year. He's in, and he's really, really good in. But I feel like this is the movie that's gonna like really put him in front of people, which is great because he deserves it because he's talented.
Yeah, he was killer. I really enjoyed his whole sort of like the swagger that he brought to his character. I thought he was great. Mike Feist, obviously
Oh, my
sort of
boy.
he burst on the scene with West Side Story. I was just looking at his IMDb not too long ago. He's actually been in a bunch of stuff since like 2015, I think. Several movies that I just have never heard of, like smaller films and stuff. But he obviously like 2021, whenever that was, 2022, when Spielberg put out his version of West Side Story, that was when Mike Feist like really blew up on the scene. And he's been in like a couple things since then. The Bike Riders, which got delayed, but that's coming out later this year.
And lest we forget, he was also on Broadway in Dear Evan Hansen and was
Oh,
great, but was smart enough to not do the movie.
yes, of course. Yeah, he's like a Tony nominee or something. He's like a
Yeah,
big Broadway guy.
he's so talented. But I do think it's forever funny. It's like, no, you were on Broadway playing this role, and you went, no, 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 I'm gonna go do West Side Story with Steven Spielberg instead.
Yeah, I really enjoyed him as well. I mean, he's like sort of like more the I guess the beta to Josh O'Connor's alpha in several
Yeah.
ways in this movie. But I thought he like stepped into that really well, given the sort of I don't know, like grittiness of riff in West Side Story. Like I thought this was a very different type of performance, and he acquitted himself very well. Just on a personal note, I was like, this guy sounds like somebody in this movie, and I can't figure out who it is. And then like, I don't know, 3/4 of the way through, I was like, John Mulaney. That's who he sounds like. So just something about the accent work and the speech patterns and stuff like that. So if anybody else happens to have my same weird brainwave kind of thing going on out there, and you're like, this dude sounds like somebody, maybe it's John Mulaney. Anyway,
All I can picture now is John Mulaney actually being in Challengers, and how hilarious that would have been.
yeah. So we got to talk about Zendaya, because this is
Oh, my
like,
girl.
yeah, this is her first big sort of solo above the title movie where she's really, the movie is being sold on her in a huge way, and she's not part of like a big ensemble like Spider-Man and Dune and stuff like that.
Wow, that is
So
Malcolm and Marie erasure, and guess what? It's fine. Erase it. It's not good.
well, yeah, theatrically anyway, I guess. Malcolm and Marie, the very what was that, black and white, like pretty small scale movie that came out on Netflix during the pandemic.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I never saw that one. Did you see that movie?
You don't need to. It's okay.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
There's some good ideas in there and great performances, but woof.
So, what did you think about Zendaya as this character, Tashi Duncan?
Oh my god, she's so phenomenal. I have been watching Zendaya forever. She's in that group of the child star into adult star realm that I'm always very fascinated by, just from like a cultural touch point. I am a huge Euphoria fan. She absolutely deserved both of the Emmys that she has gotten. Who knows if we'll ever see a season 3, but Zendaya is just she's incredible in that show. But this movie, I think, like, really understands all of her strengths as a performer and really like lets her go for it, which is just, oh god, she's so good in this movie. Because like she can change her emotion on like just the drop of a dime, but also she has so much like subtle work going on in her face throughout this movie, because this is a movie of a lot of glances. For as like sexy as this movie is, it is not gratuitous in any way. It is all an exercise in like teasing and tension and seduction and like getting right up next to it and not touching it. Like it's
Mhm.
that feeling for a whole movie, and she's so good at it.
Yeah, she's great. She's so mercurial is the word that I keep coming back to when I think about her character. Like, I loved how I couldn't really get a full read on what she was doing because there were times where I was like, does she genuinely want to be doing this thing, or is this part of like a 4D chess move where she's manipulating these guys into taking some action later on down the line that is going to be beneficial to either them or her, or is it like a combination of all of the above? And I loved that sort of ambiguity of like what exactly was going on here, because these characters don't really spell out their motivations very much in dialogue anyway. So I love that about this movie.
Yeah, I'm under the impression that she's operating like 10 steps ahead of everybody,
Mhm.
because I want to give her that power.
So yeah, let's talk about the sort of like sexiness angle of this movie. It's really being like marketed or they're really relying on that in the marketing, which I actually am sort of encouraged by, given like the uh, draconian is sex necessary, kind of conversation that seems to have been like popping up over the past few years. So I was
Mhm.
happy to see Amazon and MGM actually like leaning into that in the marketing campaign. I think some people might be a little disappointed when they actually see the movie that there's really not that much sex in this film,
Yeah.
like actual sex, but the movie, like you said in the beginning, is kind of like dripping with sex the whole way through. So it's like there's not a lot of I don't know, like explicit gratuitous stuff in this film, but every single scene just feels like these characters are either having like a form of like intellectual sex, or there's like a back and forth going on that doesn't necessarily get represented in a physical way every single time. But I just found that to be like really mesmerizing. So what do you make of this movie's I guess that its treatment of sexuality and sort of sensuality, and how it was sort of like woven into the tapestry of this film?
This entire movie is foreplay. Like that's really what it is. It's like, no, the best part of sex is not coming. It's what you do beforehand. It's the foreplay. Like that is what is fun. That is what generates intimacy. It can last as short or as long as you want it to. Like this is a thing that you very much have control over. And that is how this movie operates, is that it is constantly like edging you because it's fun and because it feels nice and because it's exciting and exhilarating, because the second it happens, the second completion happens, it's done and it's over and the fun is over. And that's not fun anymore. And so I really like how this movie is doing that, because I think so many movies in this, like the pushback against people who were like sex scenes aren't necessary. I think a lot of people are like, oh, well, then the answer to that is just like, filthy, raucous, gratuitous sex. And like, absolutely, there's a place for that. But I don't think that's the response to it. No, the response to it is this sort of thing where it's like, no, 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 we're going to remind you why yearning is such a human impulse, and why like lust and like having all of these feelings mean something.
Mhm.
Because I think really when people are like, I don't like sex scenes, I think what they're really getting to is they don't like things that don't feel like they have a purpose. And like, I've had plenty of non-purposeful sex. That's fine. But it doesn't always add to the story. Whereas in this case, like you cannot remove the tension and the yearning from this movie. It does not work without it. And so I think this is like such a great example to be like, no, 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 here's why this is important and here's why it's awesome.
Yeah, it's really the foundation on which this entire story is built. The whole thing would absolutely not work without it. And the filmmakers have talked a lot about how like this is a movie about a love triangle and how each side of that love triangle has to touch for that sort of foundation to remain intact. You know,
Mhm.
so yeah, I love that. And like the scene I mentioned or sort of alluded to about the churros and stuff. Like these two guys in the wherever it is, like the Stanford cafeteria or something, like just chomping down on churros, and one of them leans over and takes a bite of the other one. I mean, there's so much like innuendo and sort of like suggestiveness going on with the physicality between these characters. A lot of like thigh grabbing and stuff like that too. You know,
Mhm.
it's so you just don't really see it very often in movies like this. So I love that Luca came over and was just like, let me show you how it's done. You know, that's how
Yeah.
I felt like I was in the hands of somebody who was like, all right, step aside. You guys want to make a movie, you know, dripping with sexual tension. Here you go, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's like they really, really nailed it. And if it wasn't because Love Lies Bleeding hits like a very specific intersection for me. And also, we're recording this on Lesbian Visibility Day. If I don't shout out Love Lies Bleeding, I get struck by lightning. But if that movie didn't exist, I feel like Challengers would be my number one of the year. But it is very comfortably sitting at number two. And I do think it says a lot about me that my two favorite movies this year are also movies that are unapologetically horny.
Yes, for sure. So I want to talk to you about the ending of the movie. So let's get into some spoilery stuff right now. If you've not seen this film yet, definitely go seek it out. Like I said, it's one of my favorites of the year, one of BJ's favorites. It's really like this is what I want from the movies. You know, films made for adults that are original and like just exciting, and opportunities for up and coming actors to become full on movie stars. It's like a collision of a bunch of things that we care about. So, all right, now that everyone has paused or whatever, let's talk about the ending of the movie. So
Mhm.
this final match between Art and Patrick, these two guys, and Zendaya is sitting on the sidelines, and basically there's I guess one player communicates to another, hey, basically I slept with Zendaya without actually saying it. There's a whole callback to a racket move
Yeah,
that was done
placement of
earlier
the
in the
ball in the
film.
racket. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. And so that sort of spurs on this final confrontation on the court that becomes this electrifying. I guess it's a match point, the final point of this match that they're playing together, and the camera intensity picks up. I think this might be where the POV ball cam type of situation comes into play. It's like right around here.
POV ball cam means something very different, Ben. I just need to
Yeah,
make that clear.
please don't Google that. Um, but yeah, so anyway, it ends with Art's character, who is kind of like, as we've learned in previous conversations with Tashi, he's kind of like basically given up on being a professional tennis player.
Mhm.
And Tashi is not really thrilled about that. And so it ends with Art basically like getting his mojo back in a really entertaining way. And like these two guys finally like going at it on the court in a way that they've never done before. And Art like leaps up and crashes down over the net and ends up in Patrick's arms. And Zendaya, who's been watching this whole thing from horror or with horror really on the sidelines, because she understands that like some unspoken thing went down between them, and like some dam has burst, and like some information
Mhm.
has crossed that shouldn't have crossed. You know, she initially kind of seems. She screams "Come on" in the very similar way to the way that she did once earlier in the movie when she was on the court, playing somebody else in tennis. And then she goes from looking kind of like horrified to kind of like into it. And then the movie ends. So I
Mhm.
was wondering what you thought about the ending of this movie.
I think she's like this is what she's been looking for. This is what she has been wanting is like she needs Art to go that far. Like it needs to become a relationship. Like this game with your competitor, they can't be your competitor. It has to be a dance. And like she got him to that point because ultimately she's controlling the situation. Like, she's the one that's been doing all this, and she knew this is how to get it to happen, this is how to get it to work. And I think that it's very weird that as a culture we refer to people as cucks as like a negative thing, because clearly, as Challengers has shown us, the threat of cuckoldry is a great motivator. And so I really really like this ending a lot, because to me, like, she's watching what she's been working for a very long time finally pay off.
Yeah, so in that interpretation, it's almost like the ending of Whiplash or something, where it's
Oh
like
yeah.
the
Yeah, good
J.K.
call.
Simmons character kind of like you know, putting Miles Teller's character through hell basically to get this sort of glorious final result. And I have to admit, like when I first saw this movie and walked out of the theater, I was like a little confused exactly by the ending, and I think it's because I was kind of thinking of things literally, and like the immediate aftermath of what happens when this movie cuts has got to just be like a pure shit show, because we don't know exactly who wins the match, even though it seems like a pretty important thing in the plot of this movie. It's not really what the film's about. So we don't find that out. We don't know whether like art actually going over the net is like a penalty or something, and whether that means a different person would win. We don't know what this reunion between these two guys might actually lead to, or what kind of like effects or consequences that might have on Tashi and her relationship with them, or the relationship between her and her family. Like there's so many things that we have no idea what happens right afterwards, but it's not really about that. It's about just the reunion of this triangle, I think, that has been like reassembled in this final moment. To me, it felt like the relationship between those guys was fractured, and that last point, as they're playing against each other, it seems like something becomes reconstituted, and it kind of seems like the ideal form of this relationship for all three of these people is when all points on that triangle are actually connected.
Hmm.
And then that's what happens. Like for that brief moment where I think Tashi says in that beachside conversation with the guys early on in the movie, there was like real tennis happening, and like that
Hmm.
is just as much of a turn on for her as anything that she experiences physically with either one of these two dingbats. So, yeah,
I
I
think what you're trying to say is that the moral of Challengers is that it's not whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game.
I guess that's true when you think about it. When you really break it down, I
When you
believe that's
really
correct.
take it down to its fundamentals, that is really what it's about.
That's great. Okay, so anything else that you wanted to highlight about your experience watching this, or anything else that jumped out to you before we go to the interview?
I just really hope that this year is going to usher in more movies like this. I'm really hoping that with the combination of Poor Things winning some Oscars, Love Lies Bleeding being like the most viral movie so far of 2024, and now Challengers, that we're just going to usher in a new wave of like erotic cinema, because we have been in a drought for far too long. And now that I have it, I need to swim in these waters. If you drain this, I will be very upset.
Okay, you hear that, Hollywood? That's a warning from BJ Colangelo. So
That is
do
my
not.
warning. Do not drain the eroticism from my cinema. God damn it.
All right, let's take a break and then we'll be right back. Okay, so Justin Kuritzkes was watching the 2018 US Open match between Serena Williams and Naomi Osaka, and was captivated when Serena was penalized because her coach on the sidelines was allegedly communicating with her through hand signals. And Kuritzkes had never heard of that rule before, and was immediately intrigued by the idea of a tennis match where somebody really needed to have like a crucial personal conversation with the person on the sidelines but wasn't able to. And that was the spark for coming up with this movie. So with that as the sort of background information, here is my conversation with Justin Kuritzkes. Hey, Justin, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
I'm great. Congratulations on this movie. I have heard you tell the story about your inspiration for this project, so I'm not going to ask you to talk about that again, but I am curious about what your first steps were in transforming that sort of amorphous kernel of an idea into an actual story.
Uh, well, honestly, my first steps were writing the first scene of the movie, because a lot of the desire to write the movie in the first place came from this feeling I had as a tennis fan, which was that tennis was becoming the only thing that was occupying my attention in a real way. It was like the best thing I I was watching. It was better than movies, better than TV. And so I started to ask myself, what would make tennis even better? And for me, the answer to that question was if I could know what was at stake on this microscopic level for each of the players at every moment in the match. Um, and so I always kind of knew that I wanted to drop the audience right into the middle of a tennis match in this ostensibly low stakes environment, and then figure out gradually why are all these people looking at each other like this matters more than a Grand Slam. So
Yeah.
that all sort of came with the desire to write the movie in the first place. And then it really became a question for me of filling in the gaps that I didn't know as I went along. So
That
I
seems like a
was,
fun way to approach a project.
yeah, it was because there was a sort of, it sort of presented itself to me as this geometry of these three people on or around this tennis court. And then it was really a question of figuring out where I needed to jump back to understand why this mattered so much.
Yeah, that's great. I read that Luca asked you to write the scene with Tashi and the boys in the hotel room where Patrick and Art end up making out. What was that conversation like between you and Luca?
Well, it wasn't quite as direct as that. It was that, I had written this script on spec and it was, got into the hands of Amy Pascal and then Zendaya and then Luca. And Luca and I we met on the phone, and then a week later I flew to Milan to hang out with him and, figure out if we could work together, figure out if this was a collaboration that made sense. And one of the first conversations we had was that Luca said, in a love triangle, all the corners should touch. And I heard that and I thought, yeah, all these people's lives are so deeply entwined and there's all this desire flowing between all three of them. They're touching. And it quickly became clear that Luca meant, no, no, literally, they literally should all touch. And so I was thrilled by that idea. And the question then became how to make that happen in a way that felt earned and organic and that deepened the dynamics and the story that was already there and was already happening between the characters, and didn't shift everything too radically so that we lost the structure, of the movie or what happened in the movie, because we felt really good about that. So the question became where to place it and how to give it the proper runway so that it felt like it was always there, you know. And that was something that came about through a lot of conversations with me and Luca and me trying things and us talking about it. And then finally, the thing I arrived on, which was having it happen when they're juniors in that hotel room, that became something that instantly felt right to all of us. And now it's one of my favorite scenes in the movie.
I was wondering, like, I think I read that you were on set a lot for this movie, if not every day, a ton. I was curious how else the story changed over time. Did you have to like write stuff on the fly, or what was that experience like for you?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a real testament to Luca's generosity and foresight as a collaborator that he wanted me in pre-production and on set the whole time, which is not the norm necessarily for a screenwriter. I mean, it was my first script, so I had nothing to compare it to, but I quickly learned that that was not really that's not an expectation you can have. And it was a mixture of things. I mean, we had this really luxurious 6-week rehearsal process where we were going through the scenes every day with the actors and with Luca and the producers there. And so a lot of stuff was getting refined in that and through that and becoming, more in the actors' voices and in their bodies and, more lived in by them. And then there was occasional stuff that was reworked on set because either because of very practical constraints or because of the way a line was sitting in an actor's voice or, any of the kind of stuff that happens on any film ever made. Um, but there were, I'm trying to think of, well, there was a really interesting insight that Zendaya had when we were in rehearsals that changed the movie in a small but I think significant way, which is that originally I had written that Tashi and Art are traveling with a nanny for their daughter. And Zendaya said, I don't think they would have a nanny. I think she would have her family member there. She'd have her mom. And so that immediately made sense to all of us. And so Tashi's mom became a character in the movie,
Yeah.
who's traveling with them. And then it allows Patrick to say things like, "Your mom looks good," and for Tashi to say, "I know she does." So that sort of stuff was happening, which is a really amazing part of the collaboration that happens when you make a movie.
That's wonderful. Was the ending always in place? Was it always what you envisioned for when you first, I guess when you wrote your first draft?
Yeah, I mean, I think uh, this will be presented with spoiler alert or
Yes.
something.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just because I'm very careful about protecting that experience for an
Hmm.
audience. Um, I would say the last 10 minutes of the movie are pretty close to what I had always imagined. There was some sort of calibration of exactly how the last point would end. But I always knew that the movie would end uh, without us knowing who won, quote unquote, the match. And I always knew that it would end with Tashi leaping to her feet and screaming, "Come on." Um, I always kind of knew that this movie was going to end on her face screaming. Um, so yeah, but how exactly the point leads to that was something that we worked out a lot. Um, but I would say that the spirit of the ending has pretty much remained uh, consistent throughout the whole development of this movie.
I suspect people are going to have their own readings and sort of interpretations on Tashi's reaction there at the end. And I was wondering if you felt comfortable sharing your own interpretation of that scream and her response on the sidelines in the closing seconds.
No, I think that should be for people to have. I think that's part of the fun of engaging with a movie is that
Yeah,
you get to think about something like that or talk about it. So I wouldn't want to speak from any place of authority about that.
totally fair. There's so much in this movie that is said without words. And I was curious from a writing perspective how you go about conveying the intention and the meaning of those moments on the page without having dialogue to sort of fall back on in that way.
Well, a lot of that had to be in the screenplay because when you write something on spec, you're trying to make somebody see the movie on the page. You're really not trying to describe the movie or feel like you've given someone an outline for the movie. You're trying to make them feel like they've watched it. So it was important that a lot of that stuff be presented as a conversation that people were having through tennis on a tennis court and through gestures and through glances and action. Um, so, there was a sort of you try to give enough information so that it's very clear what's happening between the characters, but not so much information that you're very micromanaging a performance, you
Right.
know?
Yeah, that was going to be my next question because it seems like you would have to have something in the stage directions so people understand what the intentionality is, but you don't really want to box your actors into a corner with having to, look at things through a very narrow lens.
Well, you want to trust that they're uh, emotionally intelligent enough to read what's there and understand what's happening, to give them enough so that they can they can inhabit it themselves. And with these actors, that was never a problem, you know. So yeah, it's a bit of a delicate calibration you're doing there, but it's about just trusting that the people you're going to make the movie with um, are really smart and good at what they do, you know.
Yeah.
I think in terms of the way that the conversations without language were happening, something I found useful that found its way into the script in that I would sort of gesture at every once in a while, but certainly helped me think about the movie was I realized at a certain point that there was some relationship that the way I was thinking about tennis had to a spaghetti Western or a movie about duels. I think I even wrote at some point in the script, it's a Mexican standoff. They're all looking at each other and it's like a Mexican standoff. So there was stuff like that I found useful in terms of locating tennis within a language of film that everybody had access to.
Yeah, that's really cool. There are a couple sports that I think about like this, like I don't know, I guess golf might be one, but tennis in particular is so isolating, like unless you're playing doubles, it's just you out there and it's like
Yeah.
a mental game just as much as it is a physical one. So sort of piggybacking off of that a little bit, there's a recipe for high drama there, but it's also tough to translate exactly what those characters may be thinking during a match. And
Yeah.
so you chose not to rely on voiceover narration. And I was wondering if you ever played around with that as an option in the early days of writing the script.
No, because the desire to write the thing in the first place came from this desire to watch people have a conversation without language. So it never really, I never wanted to have anything but gesture and action and perspective dictate meaning. Because
And the
that
studio never came in and said, like, hey, it might be helpful if we got a little bit more clarity on what's going on here. I mean, I'm glad they didn't, but did that conversation ever happen?
never about voiceover. I'll say that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. One of my favorite things about this movie that I wanted to talk to you about for a second is that how it kept me guessing about Tashi's motivations. And it seems clear from the start that she can really like manipulate these guys and in basically any way that she wants. And I loved how there was some murkiness kind of about whether or not she's like a pure mercenary or if she's actually getting caught up in the emotion of certain moments or maybe this combination of both. So can you tell me about striking that balance with the Tashi character?
Well, it was important to me for all the characters that, on the surface of it, this movie includes many instances of people being selfish or petty or cruel to each other, or playing games with each other. But I think it's important that anytime they're doing that, they're also being kind. They're also trying to take care of each other in their own fucked up way. That there is a really deep care that these people have for each other because they all recognize that um, they're in this deep relationship with each other, that they can't get away from each other. And so with Tashi specifically, I think every time she does something in the movie that could be read as cruel or manipulative or could be read as her playing a sort of game, I do think it's always also coming from a place of her trying to get not just what she needs, but what she thinks these other two people need
Hmm.
too. To take care of them in a way that she feels resentful for having to take care of them, you know. Um, but she's not shirking her responsibility. She takes her responsibility to take care of them very seriously, but that's coupled with a deep resentment for being in that situation in the first place.
Right.
But also an acknowledgement that she's not an innocent in that either, that she has entered into this dynamic somewhat willingly.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think it's never the case in this movie that somebody is doing something for just one reason, or for just a uh, yeah, for just a dark reason.
Hmm.
Um, because I don't think that's how people operate in life, you know. Just like I don't think in life people ever do things for just a purely good reason. There's always a lot determining our action.
Can you talk to me about coming up with the Art and Patrick characters? Like when you were first envisioning this triangle, did you think of those guys almost as um, not necessarily mirror images of one another, but different personality types? And like what kind of evolution did each of those guys go through in your mind as you were sort of committing to this final version of them?
Well, I thought about them as two guys who had grown up together in this really deep, intense way because they're both kind of orphans. They come from these well-to-do families who have shunted them off to a tennis boarding school to be raised by coaches and raised by, administrators on a tennis court. And so they've grown up together in locker rooms and in dorm rooms and on the court. They've gone through puberty together. They've had crushes on the same girls. They've gone through all of the things that boys, go through when they're growing up, and they've done it with each other. So I think they are so deep in each other's emotional uh, and professional lives that it's inevitable that they sort of feel like mirrors of each other. Um, yeah. And I think they're both also drawn to each other because they recognize that the other one has in his game and in his life the thing that his friend is missing,
Yeah.
and vice versa, you know. So I think when you meet somebody like that, um, you're inevitably sort of drawn to them because you recognize that there's something that uh, makes them different from you in a sort of exact way.
The sauna scene is so was so powerful to me. Just like it really feels like a culmination of everything that that they've been experiencing together and how their whole relationship has been building to this moment. And then obviously the final point is like an ecstasy of its own kind. But that sauna scene really does feel like this wonderful prelude to the final confrontation, I guess, in this moment. Was that a scene that sort of flowed out of you quickly? Like, tell me about your approach to that scene in particular.
Yeah, that one did actually. I mean, it's always fun to write scenes where people are trying to say what they mean to each other, where they're trying to put it all out on the table. Um, so that scene was a joy to write, actually. It took some time to find the language of it exactly. Um, but but yeah, that wasn't one that I had to agonize over very much.
I'm wondering about because you were on set and collaborated so closely with Luca, did you know that the way that he was going to film some of these tennis scenes where the ball is flying directly at the camera, was that something that was like in your script, or is that a flourish that he added later on? Like, did you guys have any conversations about like the sort of energetic way that the tennis was actually going to be filmed in this?
Well, I mean, so much of that is just the invention and mastery of Luca and his team, his DP and yeah, and his camera operators who were incredible. Um, I knew I had a vague sense of, or sorry, I had a pretty precise sense of what the tennis was going to look like because Luca did something for this movie that he doesn't usually do, which is that he shot listed the tennis. And the way that he did that is that before we went into pre-production, me and our tennis consultant, Brad Gilbert, and this guy from ESPN named Mickey, um, we uh, we went through every point of tennis that's played in the movie. And Mickey's job is to notate highlight reels. So he notates tennis points so that they can edit highlight reels for ESPN. And he went through the script with me and Brad, and we notated every stroke of the ball that
Wow.
happens in the script. And then Brad would critique what I had written and say he wouldn't really go inside out there. He would go inside in, or he wouldn't go for the drop volley, and we had this real intense conversation about what the tennis in each moment should be so that it looked authentic and felt dynamic and real. And then we had this beat sheet of tennis points, and we brought that to real tennis players, real pro or semi-pro tennis players. And we had them play through all the points on courts in Boston, wherein Luca and me and the DP and the assistant director went around and Luca shot listed with his team. And Luca would ask me questions and ask Brad questions, and he would have his own thoughts. And then we really got to have a very firm idea of what we were going to do on the tennis court before we got there. So that when we were there, Luca had these massive, what do you call them, poster boards with all of the shots laid out, and we would know exactly what we were going to shoot that day.
Wow, that is like an unbelievable level of work that like, you don't feel that when you're watching the movie, but thinking about just doing all of that work for every single shot that's hit in this film is unbelievable. Like what did you
Well, it is, but it's also, I mean, I don't think I don't think most directors would be so bold or so brave to shoot tennis in the way that Luca shot it. But I think something that I certainly felt as we were in pre-production, and something that I think influenced the way it happened, is that we thought about tennis as fight choreography. These are action sequences, and they should be as dynamic and exciting as, anything that Jackie Chan has ever done. That's kind of how it should feel. Um, and there was a real opportunity to treat tennis that way, and Luca really took that opportunity and, went in a rocket ship with it.
Yeah, that's amazing. I was wondering if there was something that you could sort of pinpoint as like your biggest hurdle in writing this script. Was there a scene or a line or something that you got hung up on for a long time and then ultimately figured out how to tackle it?
Um, Probably the most labor-intensive thing was making sure that what was happening in the tennis match was matching what was happening emotionally, and making sure that the progression of the match was dynamic and also felt real and felt like tennis and felt like felt as dynamic as a real tennis match can feel. So that was a lot of uh, that was probably the part of the writing that felt the slowest, you know, was working through that. Um, but the other thing that's sort of really important in any story that's about a triangle or any story that's about a dynamic between three people is making sure that uh, you keep track of where all of them are in the field, you
Mhm.
know, that you don't lose track of any of them, and that whenever somebody seems to be receding into the background, they come back with a vengeance, and they reassert themselves. Um, so that was, I wouldn't call that a hurdle, but that was certainly something I was thinking about a lot as I was writing it.
Yeah, and the one last, I guess, like production level thing that I wanted to talk to you about was the like the windstorm the night before the final match. Is that something where you're writing it on the page and then you realize like, oh crap, people actually have to translate this into like a physical representation on camera? Like, did I go too far here? Is this too difficult for people to do? Like, what was your what kind of conversations did you have with Luca about like the practicality of that?
Well, Luca never shies away from that sort of a challenge. If anything, he will kind of wants more of them, you know. But it was certainly something that was a revelation to me in the process of, this being my first script and something that I wrote on spec, really just for me, that was meant to be a meaningful reading experience for people. Um, all of a sudden, when a script is getting produced, it goes from being a literary document to now being a very practical document that hundreds of people across many different departments are going to use to do their jobs every day. So I remember uh, feeling the weight of that when I was on set and I realized that every day everybody's given two things, which are the call sheet and the sides. And the sides are literally the pages that you're going to do that day. And that is often the only thing that people across all these different departments are using to know how they're going to light something, how they're going to dress people, what kind of equipment we need, all of that. So it's very hard once you see all the machinery and all the moving parts of a film production, to forget about that when you're going and writing something else.
Mhm.
It's really hard to get back to a place of innocence where you can't see those trucks unloading gear.
Right.
Um, but I think something that I found really inspiring about all of that. Because I remember sometimes we would rehearse the scene as they were setting up the equipment, as they were setting up the lighting, as they're setting up the camera, all of that. And you could see all of these different professionals at the top of their fields who have these really intense, skilled jobs, um, that they've built up experience over years or decades in the industry, and they would be listening to our rehearsal. And I remember feeling like there's so many things that can go wrong on this set. There's so many practical things that can prevent us from making the day, and it's not going to be me. because all I have to do is come up with things for people to do and for people to say. And so if that's all I have to do, I don't have to deal with any wonky equipment. I don't have to deal with the elements, you know. I have to respond to those things, but I don't have to make them happen.
Yeah.
So I found that very inspiring and energizing, and I felt a deep responsibility to all of those people when I was on set.
Gotcha. When I was preparing for this interview, I read that you're married to Celine Song, which is amazing. Past Lives was my favorite film of last year.
Oh,
And then
incredible.
I realized how cool it would have been to potentially see you both out on the awards circuit in the same year for different movies last year. I was wondering what it was like from your perspective, just watching Celine experience that whole whirlwind last year.
I mean, it was the most incredible thing in the world. I love her movie, and I'm incredibly proud of her just as her partner. And, I have known that she's this brilliant artist for the whole time I've known her. So to see other people on this massive scale recognize that was more gratifying than I can explain.
Yeah.
And I got to go around with her to a lot of these things and watch her navigate it all with this amazing level of grace and yeah. So it was a spectacular thing to be a part of.
That's so cool. John Magaro's character in that movie is loosely based on you. That must have been pretty surreal to watch that film play out from your perspective.
Well, John Magaro is one of the best actors working today. I really, really love him and love that performance. I think in terms of anybody confusing me with the character, um, I think it only can sort of break the spell of that movie or pollute the work that Celine and John and all of her actors did for anybody to sort of make too much of a slippage between me and a fictional character.
Mhm.
But I love his performance and I love that character.
Yeah, it's terrific. I have not yet read Don Winslow's City on Fire, but I know that you're working on a movie adaptation of that. And Austin Butler is lined up to star in that, which is pretty amazing. What can you tell me about your take on that project?
I can't tell you much because it's very early days, but I am very excited. I love the book. I'm really excited about Austin.
Like
But
on
yeah,
one level, it seems so different than Challengers, sort of on the page, but Challengers also has this really amazing like thriller aspect to it, and so maybe it's not as different as I would think from a writing perspective. I don't know. I mean, I know you can't go into detail, but just
maybe. I don't know. I mean, I think Challengers, I've been asked a lot of what genre I would describe it as, and the closest thing that I've heard, it's not my phrase, but I've heard somebody describe it this way, and it felt real, which is that it's an erotic tennis thriller. And I like that because I don't know what that movie looks like, you know,
yeah.
but I think it looks like Challengers.
Yeah, for sure. I think I probably have time for one more question with you. And the score for this is unbelievable. Trent and
Yeah.
Atticus, what they did with it is just kind of mind blowing, and it changes the movie in so many ways. Like I was wondering from the guy who originated this, who came up with this concept, sitting in your room, typing on a computer, to have that be added over the top of the words that you wrote and this document and everything that was put together. What was that experience like for you, just like sitting there and hearing that score over this movie for the first time?
Well, I mean, I've been such a massive fan of Trent and Atticus and their work in film forever, but I've also been a massive Nine Inch Nails fan forever. So the idea that they had even read the script was exciting to me. Luca's obviously worked with them before, and they have a deep relationship together. Um, so I was very grateful to be able to have my work be a part of that collaboration. I think the the thing that was most exciting to me beyond the score, which is incredible and is, rightfully being praised and is like, I think serves the movie so completely beautifully. I was so excited by the song at the end of the movie. That's an original song that Luca wrote lyrics for, that's inspired by this movie. That to me was the kind of surreal moment.
Yeah.
To have these people whose music has meant so much to me and this guy whose movies have meant so much to me, and they made something together that wouldn't have happened without challengers. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, that's perfect. Well, Justin, thank you so much for your time today, and congratulations on the movie. I really, really loved it.
Thank you. That really means the world to me. Thank you so much.
Cool. Take care.
Peace.
All right, that's going to do it for today's episode of the show. You can find much more about Challengers at slashfilm.com. I will link to a few things in the show notes, including our review as well. Slash Film Daily is published every weekday, bringing the most exciting news from the world of movies and TV, as well as deeper dives into the great features you can find on the site. You can subscribe to the show on Apple, Overcast, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Send your feedback, questions, comments, concerns, and mailbag topics to us at bpearson@slashfilm.com. Make sure to leave your name and general geographic location in case we mention your email on the air. Don't forget to take a minute to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That really does help us out a lot. Tell your friends about the show any way you can. Thank you so much for listening, and we will talk to you